Welcome back to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. If you've listened before, you've probably heard us talk about the bystander effect. It's one of those classic psychology ideas that slipped out of research labs and into popular culture, becoming almost a shorthand for human apathy. The story usually starts with Kitty Genovese, a young woman murdered outside of her apartment building in New York City in 1964. Newspapers at the time reported that dozens of neighbors watched from their windows and did nothing to help. That image of silent, uncaring crowds struck a nerve in the public imagination. It inspired psychologists to run famous experiments, and for decades, the lesson people took away was, when we're in groups, we don't help. The public has clung to this idea that in groups, responsibility gets diffused, courage gets diluted, and people suffer because no one steps in. But here's what most people don't know. That original newspaper account of the Genovese case was exaggerated. Later investigations found that several neighbors did call the police. Some shouted to scare off the attacker, and others comforted Kitty as she died. The narrative of total apathy was overstated, but it proved too compelling a story for people and newspapers to let go. For psychologists, it was useful because it gave them a concrete cultural moment to test in a lab. For journalists, it was a story that seemed to fit the times: urban alienation, faceless crowds, and crumbling community. Today, I'll help you take a closer look at public courage and real public reactions to threatening situations. Because if you've been following the news, you've seen communities across the country refusing to sit back silently. You've seen neighbors linking arms to stop ICE raids, protesters confronting state-perpetuated injustice, and many examples of ordinary citizens standing up in extraordinary ways. Just this week, one New York woman in a polka dot dress made headlines when she stepped in to block ICE, who were trying to profile and kidnap people in her community. And here's the thing. Research actually supports what these citizens are showing us. The bystander effect isn't inevitable or universal like we've been led to believe. Under the right conditions, people are far more willing to help than the old bystander narrative suggests. And sometimes it takes just one person to shift the whole dynamic of a crowd's reaction to harm. So in today's episode, we're going to dig deeper. We'll explore the classic research, but also the more recent studies that complicate the story. We'll talk about how authoritarian leaders thrive on making their harms feel inevitable, and how ordinary people resist that seeming inevitability with spontaneous acts of courage. We'll look at what psychology and sociology teach us about group behavior, moral identity, and collective action, and by the end I think you'll understand that while apathy can certainly be contagious, so can courage. Let's start with the basics. In the late 1960s, psychologists set out to test why it seemed that people often failed to act in emergencies. In one of their most famous experiments, they placed subjects in a room that slowly filled with smoke. When participants were alone, most quickly left the room and reported the danger. But when they were with others who stayed calm and did nothing, the majority also stayed put, even as the room became visibly filled with smoke. In another study, the people heard what they thought was another person having a seizure over an intercom. When participants believed they were the only one listening, they rushed to get help. But when they thought others were also present, they were much slower to act, and sometimes didn't act at all. From these experiments came the idea of diffusion of responsibility. This is an idea that when we're alone, the responsibility to act rests squarely on our shoulders, but in groups, we unconsciously divide that responsibility among everyone present. So if no one else moves, we assume that we don't have to either. And it's certainly a neat and tidy explanation, and it resonated because of the Genovese story. For years, textbooks, news articles, and movies kept repeating this as if it were a lesson set in stone, that groups paralyze us and crowds turn us into bystanders. Later research has complicated this tidy picture. A large meta-analysis published in the 2010s looked across dozens of studies on the bystander effect. The conclusion? The effect is real under certain very specific circumstances, but it is not nearly as strong or universal as people like to think. And in fact, some conditions make people more likely, not less likely, to intervene when others are around. For example, when the situation is clearly dangerous and requires urgent action, people often step in. The presence of others can even embolden them, especially if someone takes the first step, like Our Lady in the polka dot dress earlier this week, who inspired many others to assist their neighbors in the moment. Real-world evidence backs this up. A team of researchers reviewed hours of CCTV footage from public places in cities across 3 different countries. They examined hundreds of conflicts, including fights, assaults, and robberies. What they found was surprising. In 9 out of 10 incidents, at least one bystander intervened, and often more than one. The bigger the crowd, the more likely someone was to help. And what's especially intriguing about the CCTV findings is they reveal something the lab experiments couldn't. Context matters enormously. In those early smoke-filled room experiments, the situation was ambiguous. Is it really smoke? Is it dangerous? Will I look foolish by overreacting? But when the threat is unambiguous, when violence is clearly happening, ambiguity evaporates. People read the situation faster, and they move to help faster. There's also a distance factor that the original research didn't account for. In the seizure experiments, participants heard someone in distress but couldn't see them. The victim was abstract, disembodied. But the CCTV studies showed face-to-face encounters. When you can see someone's fear, hear their voice, watch the physical threat unfold in front of you, the psychological calculus changes entirely. Proximity breeds urgency in ways that mediated or distant emergencies don't. This matters because the kind of threats we're seeing now, raids, confrontations, public harassments, all happen in physical space where people are present. They're not abstract news stories. They're happening on your block, outside your building, in spaces where your body can actually do something. Far from proving human indifference, these findings suggest that most people actually want to help and often do. This desire to help matters because authoritarian regimes thrive on convincing people that resistance is futile. These regimes want people to believe that their power is inevitable and the harm they do is inevitable and irreversible, that nobody else will stand up, and that everyone might as well stay quiet too. It's a psychological strategy. Make cruelty seem normal and silence seem universal to try to influence people to rationalize it as the way things are. But research tells us that this isn't destiny. People intervene all the time. Communities act together, and courage is actually contagious. Sociologists call this collective efficacy, the shared belief in a community's ability to maintain order and protect one another. In neighborhoods with strong trust and cohesion, people are far more likely to step in against crime or injustice. Think about the difference between a street where neighbors know each other and one where everyone stays isolated. In the first, people act because they feel a responsibility to one another. In the second, they may choose to stay silent because they don't feel connected. Authoritarian governments often try to weaken community bonds because isolation breeds passivity. But when people rebuild those community bonds, they become much harder to control. There's also a concept in urban sociology called eyes on the street. It's the idea that safety comes not from surveillance systems or police presence, but from regular people being present in public spaces, knowing each other and having informal social contracts. The shopkeeper who knows the kids on the block, or neighbors who sit on their stoop. People who walk the same route every day and notice when something's wrong. It's not about being a busybody. It's about being embedded in your community. When you're embedded in a place, you develop place attachment, which creates obligation. You defend what you're attached to. Authoritarian systems often try to erode this through transience and isolation. Policies that destabilize housing or food security, economic pressures that force frequent moves, surveillance that makes people afraid to congregate. These fragment place attachment. Gentrification does this too, replacing stable communities with populations that have no history together. But we also see the opposite, communities that deliberately create density of connection. They make tool libraries, community fridges, skill shares, rotating childcare. These aren't just practical, they're relationship infrastructure, and they create the web of mutual obligation that makes intervention feel natural rather than heroic. Researchers who studied hundreds of people who hid or protected Jews during the Holocaust found that the same patterns held true. These rescuers weren't saints or outliers, they were ordinary people with strong moral identities shaped early in life, an expansive sense of we, and communities that made helping feel expected. Identity plus community lowered the threshold for action. That echoes exactly what we see today in local resistance networks standing up to raids and abuse of power. I've talked in previous episodes about learned helplessness, that sense of futility that sets in when repeated efforts to resist seem to fail. Under oppressive systems, people can start to believe their actions don't matter. Add that to the way authoritarian leaders encourage system justification, the belief that existing social arrangements, however unjust, are natural and unchangeable, and you can see why some people give up. But here's the other side. Learned helplessness can be broken when people see examples of successful resistance. Even small acts of defiance remind us that inevitability is only a perception, not a law of nature. Scholars who analyzed rescuers, bystanders, and perpetrators during the Nazi era found that the difference wasn't about rare heroic personalities versus heartless ones. It came down to whether people perceived common humanity in the moment, or whether they allowed targets to be seen as the other. That moral salience, seeing another person as part of us, was what predicted action. Authoritarian regimes try hard to break this cognitive pathway by dehumanizing people, because once empathy and identification switch off, intervention can collapse. So, what separates those who step up from those who don't? Research on moral identity gives us a clue. People who see morality as central to who they are, part of their self-concept, are more likely to act when they see harm being done. They don't tend to sit and calculate cost and benefit. They act because not acting would violate who they are. Empathy plays a role as well. Decades of research shows us that when we feel genuine concern for another person's suffering, we're far more likely to intervene on their behalf, even when it comes at a personal cost. This is one reason why authoritarian regimes will often try to dehumanize their targets, like we were talking about before. If they can strip away empathy, they can weaken the impulse to help. Consider how propaganda historically frames targets as criminals, animals, or threats. Once stripped of their human identity, the barrier to cruelty lowers. But empathy can't be erased so easily. There's also a timing element neuroscience reveals about moral decision-making. Brain imaging studies show that when people make moral judgments, two systems compete: a fast, automatic emotional response and a slower, deliberative, rational process. The emotional system activates immediately. You see harm and your gut responds. But then the rational system kicks in, and that's where hesitation enters. We start calculating, what will this cost me? Will I make things worse? Is this really my place? People who intervene successfully seem to have shorter gaps between those two systems, or stronger emotional responses that override that deliberative pause assessing risk. And this isn't about intelligence or careful reasoning. It's about letting the initial moral intuition carry through into action before second-guessing begins. Interestingly, time pressure increases intervention. When people don't have time to deliberate, they're more likely to help because the emotional system wins. This is counterintuitive. We think having more time to think would help us, but in this case, overthinking introduces paralysis, and our first instinct is often the most moral instinct. We've all experienced pluralistic ignorance, where everyone looks around, sees no one acting, and assumes others don't care. That silence can potentially reinforce itself, certainly, but once one person acts, the spell tends to break. Sociologists studying collective behavior have shown that people's thresholds for joining in vary. Some will act quickly, others only after seeing a few others do so. But the key is that it only takes one person to start the cascade. This is what we saw with the polka dot dress lady. Her refusal to stand by didn't just protect the people in that moment, it signaled to everyone else watching that action was possible. And once that door is opened, many more will follow. History offers a striking example. In 1943, Denmark evacuated nearly 7,000 Jews to safety in Sweden within weeks. That wasn't the work of a few isolated heroes, it was collective efficacy in action. Dense networks of fishermen, clergy, and civil servants with information flowing quickly and norms reinforcing the values they held that we protect our neighbors. Once the first groups moved, participation snowballed. It's a reminder that what feels impossible alone becomes possible together. The digital world adds another layer. Online, the bystander effect is a bit stronger. In cases of cyberbullying, for example, people often stay silent because responsibility feels diffused across thousands of potential witnesses. The same happens with online harassment, disinformation campaigns, or viral hate speech. Responsibility seems diluted, and there's a risk that silence becomes the default. But digital platforms also spread stories of resistance farther and faster than ever before. Viral videos of neighbors blocking an ICE raid or standing up to injustice remind millions of viewers that action is possible. They counter the narrative of inevitability. We've also seen the rise of digital first responders, people who amplify distress signals on social media, organize rapid response fundraisers, or coordinate real-time protest safety tips. Of course, algorithms play a role as well, sometimes amplifying authoritarian propaganda and sometimes amplifying acts of resistance. But the psychology remains. Seeing someone else take action to help lowers our own threshold for doing the same. History offers plenty of examples in addition to the story of Denmark getting Jews to Sweden in World War II. Sociologist James Scott studied what he called weapons of the weak, the small everyday acts of resistance that ordinary people use under oppressive conditions. Refusing to cooperate, quietly undermining state harm or bureaucratic violence, protecting one another in small ways. These may look minor, but together they add up to powerful resistance. There's a 2011 study of the Arab Spring that found something fascinating about how resistance spreads. Researchers mapped social networks in Egypt during the revolution and found that participation didn't spread through strong ties, your close friends and family. It spread through weak ties, acquaintances, colleagues, people you only knew casually. Why? Because your close ties already share your values and your level of risk tolerance. They'll either act when you act, or they won't act regardless. But weak ties expose you to different social circles, different risk calculations. When someone you know casually does something brave, it's surprising. It recalibrates what you think is possible for someone like me. This shows up in contemporary movements too. The spread of mutual aid networks during COVID didn't happen through activist organizations. It spread through neighborhood Facebook groups, parent email lists, building-wide chats. People who'd never considered themselves activists started delivering groceries, coordinating medicines, checking on their elderly neighbors. The action spread laterally through weak tie networks, normalizing helping behavior among populations that wouldn't identify with traditional organizing. Or consider the evolution of cop watch programs. These started in Black and brown communities decades ago as formal patrols that would follow police and document interactions. Now that model has decentralized and multiplied. Ordinary people pull out their phones during police stops, not because they're part of an organization, but because they've seen others do it online. The tactic spread through weak ties, viral videos, retweets, TikToks, until it became a reflexive response. See police encounter? Start recording. That's a norm shift achieved through social proof at massive scale. There's even a word in German for this kind of citizen defiance, Zivilcourage. I'm probably butchering that. It means civil courage, the willingness of ordinary people to publicly confront injustice despite personal risk. The term grew out of Germany's own reckoning with resistance to state harm, and it remains an active concept in research and education. Teaching civil courage is essentially teaching people how to resist inevitability, how to break silence, and how to act, even when it feels dangerous. So, what does all this mean for us right now? First, the bystander effect is not an ironclad law of human behavior. People don't automatically freeze in groups. Under the right conditions, danger, clear need, strong moral identity, community ties, people will act. Second, authoritarian leaders depend on convincing us that harm is inevitable, that nobody else will step in, and that we're safer staying quiet. That's what the violent theater of lists, destruction of buildings, abductions of your neighbors, or spreading troops into peaceful cities is designed to do: cosplay inevitability while inducing learned helplessness. But inevitability is a psychological trick, it's not reality. And third, we have more power than we think. One person's action can ripple outward, breaking silence, lowering thresholds, and giving others permission to act. The hopeful lesson here is that courage is just as contagious as apathy. The woman in the polka dot dress wasn't extraordinary in the sense of being fundamentally different from the rest of us. She simply chose to act, and in doing so, she made action thinkable for others. Communities resisting raids, neighbors protecting each other, citizens challenging injustice. These are reminders that inevitability is an illusion. The psychology of groups tells us that silence can spread, but so can defiance. And when it does, the story shifts from bystander apathy to collective courage. Let's get concrete about personal preparation, too, because understanding the psychology is one thing, and being ready to act for your neighbor is another. There's a technique we can learn from emergency response training called pre-event visualization. Before you're ever in a crisis, you mentally rehearse scenarios. What would I do if I saw someone approaching someone that's my neighbor intending to harm? What would I do if I witness an assault? Where's the nearest exit? Who can I call? This isn't paranoia, it's rehearsal. Athletes use this technique to prepare for high-pressure moments. Emergency responders drill constantly, and research shows it works because when the actual event happens, your brain recognizes the pattern. You've already made the decision in simulation, so execution is faster. There's also the question of risk assessment, which is deeply personal and depends on your own vulnerabilities. Someone who's a citizen with financial security faces different consequences than someone who's undocumented or barely making their rent. The woman in the polka dot dress had certain protections that others might not have. That doesn't mean those with more vulnerability can't act. Many do, courageously. It does mean that we need diverse tactics. If direct confrontation is too risky for you, what about documentation, legal observation, rapid response communications, offering temporary shelter, donating to bail funds? There are dozens of roles in resistance, and the research on successful movements show that we need all of them. Finally, build what organizers call affinity groups, small clusters of people you trust who've agreed in advance to act together. 5 to 8 people is usually ideal. These groups make decisions faster than large collectives. They provide built-in emotional support, and they reduce individual risk because you're never acting alone. And you're not trying to be a lone hero. You're part of a group that's part of a network. And that structure, distributed, redundant, interconnected, is both tactically smart and psychologically sustainable. You can keep showing up because you're not carrying the weight by yourself. That's where we'll leave it today. The bystander effect has long been told as a story of passivity, but the evidence and the examples around us show a different story. People are more willing to act than we think. And in times like these, remembering that might be one of the most powerful tools we have. Thanks for listening to this episode of PsyberSpace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. If you found this thought-provoking, subscribe so you don't miss a week. Give us 5 stars or a thumbs up, depending on where you listen, and share it with a friend who could use a reminder that action is possible. And remember, inevitability is only a story. The reality is that every choice, every act of courage, has the power to shift what feels possible for everyone else. Stay curious, and you'll find those people with the courage to stand up.